Well, welcome everyone to this week's Rising Tide Foundation lecture, where we are rounding out our multi-month journey through the topic, the Symposium of Storytelling, Myth-Making, and Universal History. It's been a fun ride, and to bookend this entire ride, we have a long-awaited presentation by Cynthia Chung, who has done an immense amount of work conducting a deep dive into the mind, the spirit, and the context, the world in which C.S. Lewis lived. I had not been that familiar with Lewis's work. I've read a few pieces, a few essays here and there, but I didn't really have as much of an appreciation for the multidimensional, rich character that he actually is, and that I've been privileged to get the firsthand experience from, just having being provided briefings by Cynthia on a daily basis, which is great. So I won't say anything more. I won't give any spoilers, Cynthia. I'm sure that you're going to say many things to surprise us. And this is the first part of 2 lectures that will be done on this topic, the next one continuing next Sunday. So like usual, if anyone wants to ask a question when the main presentation is over, please put your name in the chat box and I'll call upon you in queue, or Pascal will if my internet goes down here. And that's it. Cynthia, it's all yours.
Okay. Thank you. Can everyone see that fine? Okay. So yes, this is going to be part 1 of a part 2 lecture series, and in this part, it's known by C.S. Lewis as the Space Trilogy. We won't call it that. For those who are familiar with it, it should be obvious, because that's something actually that he's intervening upon. We'll call it the sci-fi trilogy. And I titled it A Journey Out of the Deep Black Void. So this presentation, it'll be focusing on comparing C.S. Lewis's part 1, Out of the Silent Planet, versus H.G. Wells's The First Men in the Moon. And then part 2 will go into Perelandra, That Hideous Strength. It'll be the more interesting lecture of the 2, although I hope both of them will be very interesting. And we'll also discuss the abolition of man as well in part 2 of this lecture series. Okay, so for those who aren't aware, C.S. Lewis, other than writing Narnia and the Screwtape Letters, is known for the sci-fi trilogy that I just call That Hideous Strength, because it's the conclusion, and it's really a critique about where we are at presently that is it's very crucial, and I think there's a lot of revisitation to C.S. Lewis's work because of this. So Out of the Silent Planet was published in 1938, Perelandra 43, 45. So you can see that it's during the period where Aldous Huxley, he published Brave New World, I believe, in 39. And George Orwell was something like 44, 45. So they're all coming around the same time. That Hideous Strength is known also as a dystopic novel, but it's not at all like the Brave New World or even 1984, which we will find out for those who are not familiar. And he's basically intervening on this popular view that is starting to come out, especially after World War I, where a lot of people were becoming very cynical and existential, and you had increasingly this lost generation type mentality and view to the world. So The First Men in the Moon, H.G. Wells, this book was published in 1901. And H.G. Wells was a prolific writer, but people should be aware that a lot of the work that he did was based off of especially Jules Verne's work, which, you know, here I have, this is blocking, From the Earth to the Moon. in 1867, but it was Kepler who did the first fiction of the heavens, you can say, or space, in 1634, and it was Christian Huygens who did the first fiction on inhabitants of planets or aliens. The thing that is really striking about H.G. Wells's work, however, in comparison to these sci-fi novels, is that H.G. Wells had a very negative view of what our influence would be on, things that were basically of the galactic or solar system scale. So it started to become a much more cynical view of mankind going into the next unknown. And at this point in time as well, for much of history, we referred to space as the heavens, but increasingly, especially out of the Enlightenment, the heavens started to be, there was atheism that was starting to become much more prominent. And there was a view now that the heavens was actually something not only empty, but it was like a dark void, an abyss of nothing. It was something very cold and unfriendly, which was a very different way of looking at things than how centuries before, cross-cultural, like all works basically of great civilizations had always thought of space as the heavens before that. So what else do I want to say for this? This new concept of the heavens as now being empty space came out of what you could call modern science. And whether it was a deterministic or random view, the goal of the 20th century was the same: to promote a concept of the universe that had no governing purpose, no directionality, and no morality, ultimately. That it was essentially a mechanism discoverable by a few simple mathematical laws. With such a view, our connection to the universe becomes inconsequential, with the universe seen as something cold, unknowable, and ultimately dead or dying. Such a concept only further enforces that there is no real meaning to anything. There is no purpose. At least it is not a purpose that we have a place in. So C.S. Lewis, in his sci-fi trilogy, is very clearly intervening on this viewpoint, and you can even just see from the comparison of the two book covers how different the concept is. Even though neither are accurate, I think it's still important to look at how they're both approaching this subject, which is ultimately, has the definition of ourselves within it. Because if we are ultimately something negative, should we really be going to other planets or not, right? So what I would say for people who are fans of H.G. Wells, I know that there are a lot of fans, they need to understand that he did not write his books just purely as fiction meant for entertainment, but there was always ultimately the purpose of pushing forward a certain ideology, philosophy. And C.S. Lewis understood this, and this is precisely what he was intervening upon with his Hideous Strength series. Lewis could see that this view of the universe, and thus humankind situated within that definition, the purpose and nature of humankind, that this would only lead us towards a scientific dictatorship, which he astutely predicts and describes in part 3. What gave Lewis the power of insight into this was his method of reason. This method is the Platonic method, and this is observed very clearly within the series in how characters are engaging in dialogue. Lewis mentions the Platonists by name as well by the end of part 1 out of the Silent Planet, which we'll go into when we get there. Another important thing that people should know is that Lewis was president of the Oxford Socratic Club from 1942 until 1954, until he left to teach at Cambridge. And the Oxford Socratic Club was to follow the practice of Socrates, to follow the argument wherever it led them. Since much of what we hold as opinion can be held up by false beliefs, assumptions, or axioms, by following an argument all the way through, absurdities and inconsistencies will reveal themselves, and thus a closer approach to truth can be found by recognizing what does not partake in truth. So Lewis used this method, especially on debates with atheists who claimed a similar view to that of the camp of H.G. Wells and Bertrand Russell, which we've already talked about a little bit, and to which he uses in this sci-fi series. Thus, Lewis's use of Plato is absolutely essential and should not be discussed as a sideline topic, as is all too often the case, if he's mentioned at all. The study of Plato was a central component to Lewis's approach to philosophy and reason, including in his religious views. So for H.G. Wells, I feel that there will be some people who might be upset with what I've said so far about him. And so I wanted to share just a few quotes and some highlights of his life very quickly before we move forward. T.H. Huxley, Darwin's bulldog, was the mentor of H.G. Wells. And with the advent of Darwinism, a theory that not even T.H. Huxley himself believed to be true, he's on record for this, nevertheless promoted it ruthlessly. And we can't deny that two major changes occurred in modern science as a result of T.H. Huxley's promotion of Darwin's theory of evolution, which was number one, nature, and thus one could say the universe, was not governed by purpose, but rather by randomness, and that two, man was but a beast, no longer to be among the children of God, no longer regarded as partaking in anything that was divine or sacred. Thus, it was not a far step to further pose, and if man is but a beast, what does he care for higher truths? What more, or can he even know higher truths? What does a beast need than the simple forms of comfort and happiness? So H.G. Wells wrote a trilogy of scientific and philosophical treatises, which he himself termed the New Bible. This should replace the Bible. And he explicitly states in his Open Conspiracy Blueprints for a World Revolution these views. One of the books included in this New Bible trilogy was The Science of Life, which he co-wrote with Julian Huxley, who, among many other things, was the originator of the term transhumanism, and also served as the vice president of the British Eugenics Society from 1937 to 44, and its president from 1959 to 1962. He's pretty much a founder as well of UNESCO. And transhumanism is a subject that C.S. Lewis gets into in part 3. But it's a theme that is constantly being talked about in a more subtle way in part 1 and part 2, and eugenics. So yeah, at the very end of The Science of Life, he writes, if someone wants to read the quote.
Just so everyone knows, they're on mute. So if you want to read the quote, you have to unmute.
Well, Matt, just read it at this point and then we'll.
Okay, all right. To have a world encumbered for a time with an excess of sterile jazz dancers and joyriders may be a pleasanter way to elimination than hardship and death. Pleasure may achieve what force and sword have failed to do. The world can afford it. It is not a thing to fret about. It is only a passing fashion on a grand scale, this phase of sterilized enjoyment. The great thing is that it should be able and willing to sterilize itself. The types that have a care for their posterity and the outlook of their race will naturally be the types which will possess the future.
So yeah, H.G. Wells has a lot of distasteful quotes, and this quote is actually one of the less distasteful ones. And he finds himself being very humane in this, because people can just sterilize themselves. They can live their life however they want, but they won't be passing on those that bad biological content to the next generation, and we can look forward to a more decent society in the future. He also mentions in the Life of Science, right? What the where was it? Yeah, pleasure may achieve what force and sword have failed to do. Right. So that's a reference to World War I as well. It was not. It was well known that wars were also made to thin the population. And so he's saying that pleasure might be more effective in this than wars have been. In his anticipations of the reaction of mechanical and scientific progress upon human life and thought, published in 1901, the same year as The First Man in the Moon, he writes, if someone would like to read it.
Do you want me to do it again?
Sure.
Okay. It has become apparent that whole masses of human population are, as a whole, inferior in their claim upon the future to other masses, that they cannot be given opportunities or trusted with power as the superior peoples are trusted, that their characteristic weaknesses are contagious and detrimental to the civilizing fabric, and that their range of incapacity tempts and demoralizes the strong. To give them equality is to sink to their level. To protect and cherish them is to be swamped in their fecundity. Lovely.
Yeah. So all of these works that I referenced of H.G. Wells, they had already been completed by the time that C.S. Lewis wrote his sci-fi trilogy. And T.H. Huxley and Julian Huxley were now the only Huxleys Wells had contact with. He also was relatively close to Aldous Huxley. And as we will come to see, The First Man in the Moon has a lot of similarity and overlap with Huxley's Brave New World. Oh, okay, I have that in my note. It was published in 1932, which was, Brave New World was not conceptualized by Aldous Huxley, as if you read a lot of H.G. Wells's and Bertrand Russell's work, that'll be very clear. And apparently there's even a letter from Bertrand Russell to his publisher where he was contemplating charging Aldous with plagiarism because he took a lot from Russell's The Scientific Outlook, including the soma drug and that Shakespeare should be banned, among other things. So yeah, if you want to learn more about this, because we're going to move on, you can find two papers I wrote, Who Will Be Brave in Huxley's New World, The War on Science in the 20th Century Descent of Man, and also another paper, Why H.G. Wells's The Shape of Things to Come Has Arrived Today, on my Substack. Right, so in conclusion to the horrible H.G. Wells quotes, Open Conspiracy, Blueprints for a World Revolution, 1928, he explains his view on what the new world religion should be.
The character of Open Conspiracy will now be plainly displayed. It will have become a great world movement as widespread and evident as socialism or communism. It will have taken the place of these movements very largely. It will be more than they were. It will be, frankly, a world religion. This large, loose, assimilatory mass of movements, groups, and societies will be definitely and obviously attempting to swallow up the entire population of the world and become the new human community.
Okay, so before we get into the, I will go over the books a little bit, because I like to do that, because I don't assume that people have read them or that they're even, necessarily fresh in their mind. I just want to share a few quotes before we do that. which just goes to show what H.G. Wells was heavily promoting in terms of this view of the universe as this dark void. Matt, since you're doing such a wonderful job, you can continue.
Oh, shucks. Okay, page 51. Between the stars was the wait. This is
these are quotes. Sorry, yeah, these are quotes from The First Man in the Moon, just talking about how he's describing the universe.
Okay, H.G. Wells. Okay. Between the stars was the void, the unfathomable darkness. I tried to recall the fragmentary knowledge of astronomy I had gained in my irregular reading, but it was all too vague to furnish any idea of the things we might expect. At last, I got back to bed and snatched some moments of sleep, omens of nightmare, rather, in which I fell and fell and fell forevermore into the abyss of the sky. And then on page 58.
Oh, you don't have to read the pages. Don't worry about it.
Okay. The transparent blackness of the glass behind him made him seem as though he floated in a void. And then a little later, over me, around me, closing in on me, embracing me ever nearer was the eternal, that which was before the beginning, and that which triumphs over the end, that enormous void in which all light and life and being is but the thin and vanishing splendor of a falling star, the cold, the stillness, the silence, the infinite and final night of space.
Okay, so very quickly, there are two main characters to The First Men in the Moon, which are Mr. Bedford and Mr. Caver, which I find are kind of like two versions of H.G. Wells himself. So Mr. Bedford is he's rung up a lot of debt, gambling or whatever, and he has it in his mind that he's going to write a famous literary work and he's going to make a lot of money. And as he's struggling with this, he has a neighbor that he sees walking very eccentrically outside of his home, and they somehow get to talking. This is a picture of Mr. Caver. And Mr. Caver is a scientist, and he has come up with this idea of an anti-gravity material, which it doesn't make any sense the way H.G. Wells, none of the science in The First Man in the Moon makes any sense, but needless to say, he ends up inventing this thing that's anti-gravity. And when they first succeed in creating this, because Mr. Bedford starts to also get really excited in this plan because he's more interested in the money-making aspect of it, there's like a huge explosion when the first experiment is done successfully, and it causes like a ton of damage to the whole like surrounding area, and who knows, people could have been killed. They never really quite find out or verify, and so this is a bit of the dialogue where Mr. Caver exclaims, quite correct, I've done it and it's all right. But Mr. Bedford protested, all right, why there can't be a rick standing, or a fence or a thatched roof undamaged for 20 miles around. I think that's a typo. Mr. Caver, it's all right, really. I didn't, of course, foresee this little upset. My mind was preoccupied with another problem, and I'm apt to disregard this practical side issue. But it's all right. Mr. Bedford, but the explosion. Mr. Cavers, it was not an explosion. I suppose, said Mr. Bedford, the air would be rushing up and up over that infernal piece of stuff now. Precisely, Mr. Cavers said, a huge fountain spouting into space. Good heavens, why, it would have squirted all the atmosphere of the earth away. It would have robbed the world of air. It would have been the death of mankind, that little lump of stuff. And then Mr. Caver responds to this, if they have perished, these are some of the laborers they had working in their lab, it's no great loss. If they have not perished, I doubt if they have the intelligence to explain the affair. Of course, we must make it again, he said with a sort of glee. If we can possibly avoid wrecking this little planet of ours, we will, but there must be risks. And I find that this is very interesting because in some ways, like H.G. Wells is aware of his madness, because all throughout the book, there are things like this being said almost as if it's a critical tone, but ultimately when you finish the book, it's sort of like, you know, justified in the end, right? It's always these unpleasantries that, well, you know, we have either unpleasantry type A or unpleasantry type B, and it's always a matter of like weighing which one ultimately is the better unpleasantry to be pushing onto society. So another, so they end up being successful in creating a spaceship with this anti-gravity material, and they land on the moon. And I'm not going to explain fully how things happen in the novel, but they meet an alien race on the moon. They became intoxicated by fungi that they ate on the moon, and then they woke up in chains. And they're kind of described as like part insect, part octopus like. And in this section, Mr. Bedford is describing Mr. Cavour. He says, Mr. Cavour went on to talk of the enormous and wonderful world in which we were being taken, which to Mr. Bedford was very scary. They were being taken down, down, down into the moon with this alien species that they couldn't communicate with at all. I realized slowly from his tone that even now he was not absolutely in despair at the prospect of going ever deeper into this inhuman planet, Burrow. His mind ran on machines and invention, to the exclusion of 1,000 dark things that beset me. It wasn't that he intended to make any use of these things. He simply wanted to know them. So we're seeing a bit of a theme here. You want to do the experiment for the sake of the experiment, no matter what are the risks. And even here, it's not even utility in this case that is being pushed forward. It's simply the need to know, but without any kind of boundary condition around that. This is just a picture. So as they start to, Mr. Bedford ends up escaping, and he leaves the moon, and Mr. Cavour, they thought they got separated and they thought the other had died. Mr. Cavour gets injured, and then he is brought back into the underworld of these alien creatures on the moon, and he realizes that the first ones he encountered were dumber, as he suspected, and that they're more like I guess like police or warriors and or guards. And then he ends up meeting ones that are all like very different, and H.G. Wells describes this as like how an ant colony will have different ants with physical specializations, and everybody has their own role and everything. So these are different alien subtypes of the same species that are now carrying him further in. And he realizes that they're actually very intelligent. This is what he's saying, and that they're actually superior in every way to the humankind. And then he goes on to explain why he thinks this. Anyone want to read, or Matt, if you want to continue?
I've got a little bit of noise in my background, so maybe
okay. I'll do it.
Okay.
There we go.
All right.
In the moon, says Cavour, every citizen knows his place. He is born to that place, and the elaborate discipline of training and education and surgery he undergoes fits him at last so completely to it that he has neither ideas nor organs for any purpose beyond it. They check any incipient disposition to other pursuits. They encourage his mathematical bias with a perfect psychological skill. His brain grows, or at least the mathematical faculties of his brain grow, and the rest of him only so much as is necessary to sustain this essential part of him. At last, save for rest and food, His one delight lies in the exercise and display of his faculty. His one interest in its application, his sole society with other specialists in his own line. His brain grows continually larger, at least so far as the portions engaging in mathematics are concerned. They bulge ever larger and seem to suck all life and vigor from the rest of his frame. His limbs shrivel, his heart and digestive organs diminish. His insect face is hidden under its bulging contours. His voice becomes a mere stridulation for the stating of formula. He seems deaf to all but properly enunciated problems. The faculty of laughter, save for the sudden discovery of some paradox, is lost to him. His deepest emotion is the evolution of a novel computation, and so he attains his end.
So as you can see, H.G. Wells is obsessed with cranium size or brain size as a determinant of how intelligent you are. And he is describing a society where you can basically, from a young age, you can see, you know, I guess, what are certain things that they're more interested in or have a faster learning curve in. And then you just continuously want to feed that part. That part of the brain will grow larger and larger and larger until it takes up all the rest of the other parts of the brain, so that they are not even concerned with anything else now but their specialization. And this is regarded as a beautiful thing by Mr. Caver, and I suspect H.G. Wells, and you can see clearly the similarities with a Brave New World concept as well, right? Because keep in mind, H.G. Wells doesn't think that this is a fate for himself, right? This is a fate for how you have specialization and labor in society, basically. So eventually Mr. Caver is taken to the big head, the guy in charge. And there is the big head is asking him all of these questions. Oh, wait, no, wait, first. Before the questions, Mr. Caver goes on to explain how the structure of the society is set up. So he says, these beings with big heads on whom the intellectual labors fall, so, you know, they're like the ones in charge, form a sort of aristocracy in this strange society. And at the head of them, quintessential of the moon, is that marvelous gigantic ganglion, the grand lunar. This is the guy with the biggest head, into whose presence I am finally to come. The unlimited development of the minds of the intellectual class is rendered possible by the absence of any bony skull in the lunar anatomy. So this, you know, cream of the cream class, they don't have a limit to how big their brains can get, because they are missing certain bony compartments of the skull. So as you see in the picture, it can get just as big as your massive intellect will produce. They fall into three main classes, differing greatly in influence and respect. There are the administrators of considerable initiative and versatility, responsible each for a certain cubic content of the moon's bulk. The experts, who are trained to perform certain special operations, and the erudite, who are the repositories of all knowledge. With regard to these latter, it is a curious little thing to note that the unlimited growth of the lunar brain has rendered unnecessary the invention of all those mechanical aids to brain work which have distinguished the career of man. There are no books, no records of any sort, no libraries or inscriptions. All knowledge is stored in distended brains. And to rule over these things and order any erring tendency there might be in some aberrant natures are the most muscular beings I've seen in the moon, a sort of lunar police, who must have been trained from their earliest years to give a perfect respect and obedience to the swollen heads. So he's basically, you know, describing a computer hive of information in the form of an ant colony, which, yeah, is creepy that that was already being thought about in 1901. I mean, that was a pretty advanced concept in that sense. He goes on to say, right, he's describing this process of how these young Selenites, the ant-like aliens, are being reared for their specialization. He says, quite recently, I came upon a number of young Selenites confined in jars from which only the forelimbs protruded, who were being compressed to become machine minders. So I would say that this is probably the lowest of the classes of a special sort. You could say the deltas in Huxley's world. The extended hand in this highly developed system of technical education is stimulated by irritants and nourished by injection, while the rest of the body is starved. The earlier stages, these queer little creatures are apt to display signs of suffering in their various cramped situations, but they easily become indurated to their lot. It is quite unreasonable, I know, but such glimpses of the educational methods of these beings affect me disagreeably. I hope, however, that may pass off, and I may be able to see more of this aspect of their wonderful social order. Of course, it is really in the end a far more humane proceeding than our earthly method of leaving children to grow into human beings and then making machines of them. So again, very typical of the H.G. Wells, Aldous Huxley method, where you say, oh yes, I know this sounds horrifying, but in the end, isn't this much more of a humane course than what we do on Earth? And he goes on also to say that when you don't need these workers that are specialized in their labor, there's no need for their employment. You just have to put them on opiates and they go into a slumber, which you can then awake them when you need them. But if not, then they're just, kind of tucked away, almost like in a storage container, sleeping. And Cavor also thinks this is a humane solution to the unemployment problem. Another common thing to Aldous Huxley's Brave New World is mothers do not raise their children, but rather celibate females, of which in some cases carry brains almost of masculine dimension. And then concluding this, and then we're going to get into C.S. Lewis. H.G. Wells ends this by saying, for my own part, a vivid dream has come to my help, and I see, almost as plainly as though I had seen it in actual fact, a blue-lit, shadowy, disheveled Cavor struggling in the grip of these insect Selenites, struggling ever more desperately and hopelessly as they press upon him, shouting, expostulating, perhaps even at last fighting, and being forced backward step by step, out of all speech or sign of his fellows, forevermore into the unknown, into the dark, into that silence that has no end. Because in the end, Cavor is being questioned by the big head, the biggest head, about things on Earth, and it's quickly being seen that Cavor is describing Earth as a very unfriendly place, and that Cavor is the only guy who knows how to create humans as a spacefaring species, and so they likely ended up killing him. So for C.S. Lewis, why do I keep saying it funny? C.S. Lewis's Out of the Silent Planet, the main characters are Ransom, who pretty much everyone is in agreement is modeled off of Tolkien, who was a very close friend of Lewis, and there's a lot of overlap with their work in fiction, since they were always discussing with each other. Ransom is a philologist and a don at Cambridge College. And the other characters are Devine and Weston. Weston is the scientist in this novel, and Devine, I call him Devine. He's schoolmates with Ransom. They went to the same school and also are Cambridge peers, but they always avoided each other because they already understood that there was a strong disliking for each other. So Ransom is doing one of these walking tours at the start of the novel, which is something that C.S. Lewis did with his brother. I don't know if Tolkien did that. And he is trying to find a place to stay because all of the hotels are full, and he ends up coming across this house. And long story short, he is walking to the front door because this woman, she's asking she's looking for her son who does labor for this particular house, but he should have arrived home by now. And he sees a scene with Weston and Devine struggling with this boy who it becomes clear is mentally challenged. And so it's a little bit of a strange situation that Ransom walked into, but then he knows Devine, and he says as well, you know, we tend not to suspect evil or, you know, bad wrongdoing, especially with someone that you went to the same school with. So he's kind of brushing off that there are some very strong signs that something untoward is occurring. And basically what happens is the boy is allowed to go home. They drug Ransom, and Ransom is going to be now the replacement for their plan, which is that Weston has invented a spaceship, and they're going to be going to this place called Malacandra, which we find out is the true name of Mars. And they don't tell Ransom a lot while they're like on the spaceship, and they basically Weston says, like, you know, if you knew the whole story, you would be so honored that to be a part of this mission. That's kind of all we're told at the beginning. And there are a few things that he says. What is this? This is Weston. So this is some of Weston's viewpoints. As it is, I admit that we have had to infringe your rights. My only defense is that small claims must give way to great. As far as we know, we are doing what has never been done in the history of man, perhaps never in the history of the universe. We have learned how to jump off the speck of matter on which our species began, infinity, and therefore perhaps eternity, is being put into the hands of the human race. You cannot be so small-minded as to think that the rights of the life of an individual or of a million individuals are of the slightest importance in comparison with this. So it's a line that I think we're all familiar with. Well, said Ransom, you hold the cards, and I must make the best of it. I consider your philosophy of life raving lunacy. I suppose all that stuff about infinity and eternity means that you think you are justified in doing anything, absolutely anything, here and now, on the off chance that some creatures or other descended from man as we know him may crawl about a few centuries longer in some part of the universe. Yes, anything whatever, returned the scientist sternly, and all educated opinion is entirely on my side, for I do not call classics and history and such trash education. So you can see a very clear headbutting already that's starting to occur between the Weston, who's like representing a modern science type of perspective, and Ransom, who is trained in linguistics and the classical studies and history. That's another, anyway. So we then hear what C.S. Lewis has to say in terms of his take on what are the characteristics of the universe, if someone wants to read it.
I vote for Madeline.
Okay.
I'll do it, but it's very small.
Oh. It's okay. I'll read this one then if it's
okay. It's a little hard on my eyes.
They're totally immersed in a bath of pure ethereal color and of unrelenting, though unwounding, brightness, stretched his full length, and with eyes half closed in the strange chariot that bore them, faintly quivering through depth after depth of tranquility, far above the reach of night, He felt his body and mind daily rubbed and scoured and filled with new vitality, Weston, in one of his brief, reluctant answers, admitted a scientific basis for these sensations. They were receiving, he said, many rays that never penetrated the terrestrial atmosphere. But Ransom, as time wore on, became aware of another and more spiritual cause for his progressive lightening and exaltation of heart. A nightmare long engendered in the modern mind by the mythology that follows in the wake of science was falling off him. He had read of space. At the back of his thinking for years had lurked the dismal fancy of the black, cold vacuity, the utter deadness which was supposed to separate the worlds. He had not known how much it affected him till now that the very name space seemed a blasphemous libel for this empyrean ocean of radiance in which they swam. He could not call it dead. He felt life pouring into him from every moment. How indeed should it be otherwise, since out of this ocean of the worlds, all their life had come? He had thought it barren. He saw now that it was the womb of the worlds, whose blazing and innumerable offspring looked down nightly even upon the earth with so many eyes, and here, with how many more? No, space was the wrong name. Right, so from now on, we'll call it the heavens for the rest of this lecture series, and hopefully, we'll intervene upon ourselves too when we're using the word in other forms. So these are the names that C.S. Lewis has for the real names of the planets, and Fulcandra is the name of Earth, Perelandra is Venus, and Perelandra will be in part 2 of the discussion. And again, Malacandra is Mars. So, right, I need to explain very quickly that, so C.S. Lewis also has the word Smalaldil for God, and then there are earth creatures such as Oyarsa, or entities, you could say, which are kind of like angels, but C.S. Lewis himself says that they're not what you would typically think of with an angel. And then you have the Aldeals. And Oyarsa, you have an Oyarsa for each planet. And then you have Malaldil, that is God. And then you have Aldeals that are kind of like, you could say fairies, sprites, or yeah. They're not really totally, it's like they're a material, but we're not able to really see them so clearly. He doesn't go into detail what they are though, but they're kind of like the messengers of the Oyarsa, the ruling Oyarsa. Right, so when Ransom lands on Malacandra with Weston and Divine, he runs away, he escapes, and he eventually meets the Hirosa. I don't have time to explain all of the characters, but basically the Hirosa you can see here are the poets, and here is their first encounter, a picture of their first encounter. He's actually offering him an alcoholic drink, so they immediately became good friends. And you have the Sorn to the top right, also known as Saroni, and you can see how small a human is next to them. They're more like the analytical, mathematical type, but they also are like the, they know the facts. They're like encyclopedias, I guess you could say, as well. But they're more than that too. They're not just like analytical or logical, but that's their basis. And the Piffle Triggy, who are these sculptors, they make, trinkets, they do inventions, things like this. And you find that there is a universal language in Malacandra, which is something that C.S. Lewis really stresses, and is one of the problems with Earth, is that we have forgotten the old language, which they all use the old solar language, but he's also saying that it was the Harosa's language. And it's fitting that everybody uses the Harosa's language because they are the poets. What do I want to say more than that? No, I'll just move on. So I'm not going to go through this discussion, but basically he's realizing that on Malacandra, there are no wars between the species. They all, you know, they don't have any issue with each other, even though they're very different, and they can even make fun of each other and everything. They don't have the problems that you would see commonly on Earth. And here Ransom is asking Hiyoi, who is the Harosa that we saw in the picture, you know, why don't you have wars though? Like, and you know, Hiyoi is asking like, well, why would we, like, what would we fight over? It's like food. It's like, oh, we always have plenty of food. What's the problem? And then he starts to talk about like, well, if you have too many kids though, won't like it become an issue? And then they start to get into this conversation of love and the seeking of pleasure, because on Earth the seeking of pleasure is something that you could say is a unbounded. It can become obsessive with a lot of people. Probably I would say most people have some kind of, you know, obsession with a certain kind of pleasure, and that on Malacandra they don't have this this view of pleasure. And we'll see that on Perelandra as well. It's an even more you could say advanced concept of what is exactly pleasure. And again, keep in mind, like with Socrates and Plato, you know, this whole thing, that the theme that he's constantly talking about in terms of it's not good to always just strive to avoid pain and to gain pleasure, and that there are obviously different levels of pleasure, because there can also be pleasure of learning, for instance, versus pleasure of gluttony or something like that. So he's talking about this, and Hiyoi is saying like, well, why would you want to do something over and over again, even if it's pleasurable? Because part of the pleasure is the remembering. And Hiyoi, the poet, Harosa, is making the point: a pleasure is only fully grown when it has been remembered. You're speaking, Hamen, as human, as if the pleasure were one thing and memory another. It's all one thing. And then he makes, you know, an example of poetry, poems. And Ransom says like, well, what if you wanted to just hear one line of a poem over and over again? And that Hiyoi responds, the poem is a good example, for the most splendid line becomes fully splendid only by means of all the lines after it. If you went back to it, you would find it less splendid than you thought. You would kill it, I mean, in a good poem. But in a bent poem, Hiyoi, Ransom asks, a bent poem is not listened to, Hamen. And how of love in a bent life? So you can see this is going to be a theme that one of the big themes that C.S. Lewis is also addressing in this series. So this is Weston now at the end of Malacandra. I mean, at the end of the right. Another thing to note is that Earth is called the silent planet because Earth has the only situation where the Oyarsa, which in other words, Satan, has rebelled against God. And so there is no communication now with Earth and the other planets of the solar system, and you could say, you know, maybe the universe. So it's become a silent planet, detached from everything else. And so the Oyarsa is actually asking, you know, Ransom and Weston and everything, what is going on Earth, because they have been actually detached from it for a very long time. And Weston and Divine, never really understood or were able to look at the life on Malacandra as basically intelligent life, right? Because all three species are capable of language. They're intelligent. They're not just beasts. And Weston still is of the view that this planet needs to be dominated. So it's an imperial viewpoint, as we will see. C.S. Lewis is exploring the different levels of, you could say, corruption into outright evil throughout the series. So still Weston and Divine, like Divine is more interested in getting rich off of the mining of Mars, and Divine thinks that Mars can be the new habitation for the human race, and he's willing to eradicate all the present life on Mars to do that. When we go into Perelandra and that hideous strength, we're going to be exploring more of a evil, you can say, approach. In this case, these things are still more on the innocent side of things, if you can believe it. So Weston's just talking about his viewpoint here. To you, I may seem a vulgar robber, but I bear on my shoulders the destiny of the human race. Your tribal life with its Stone Age weapons and beehive huts, its primitive coracles and elementary social structure has nothing to compare with our civilization, with our science, medicine, and law, our armies, our architecture, our commerce, and our transport system, which is rapidly annihilating space and time. Our right to supersede you is the right of the higher over the lower. Life is greater than any system of morality. Her claims are absolute. It is interesting, right, that he said that life is higher than morality, and not that they are, you know, the same, that they're organized within the same. Well, we'll talk about that. It is not by tribal taboos and copybook maxims that she has pursued her relentless march from the amoeba to man and from man to civilization. She, life, has ruthlessly broken down all obstacles and liquidated all failures. And today, in her highest form, civilized man, and in me as his representative, she presses forward to that interplanetary leap which will perhaps place her forever beyond the reach of death. So this seems to be the ultimate goal, right? Life for the sake of life, and life is in opposition to its enemy, death. And it's as simple as that. It doesn't seem to really matter how you choose to live that life, or how you choose to affect other life, how you situate yourself in that context. It's in her right, the right, or if you will, the might of life herself, that I'm prepared without flinching to plant the flag of man on the soil of Malacandra, to march on step by step, superseding where necessary the lower forms of life that we find, claiming planet after planet, system after system, till our posterity, whatever strange form and yet unguessed mentality they have assumed, dwell in the universe wherever the universe is habitable. I may fall, but while I live, I will not, with such a key in my hand, consent to close the gates of the future on my race. What lies in that future beyond our present ken passes imagination to conceive. It is enough for me that there is a beyond. So Weston feels he can partake in a sort of, you could say, a corrupt form of immortality, and that his idea of immortality is just that our biological material will continue to exist in the future, no matter what, and you could somehow live through that. Whereas we've discussed multiple times with the Rising Tide Foundation, a very different type of immortality, quality to immortality. So Oyarsa responds to this: "It is well that I have heard you, for though your mind is feebler, your will is less bent than I thought. It is not for yourself that you would do all of this." Now, Weston before was speaking in English and Ransom was translating. Now he's speaking in Malacandrian, so it's all broken, and he sounds like like he can't speak very well. "No," said Weston proudly in Malacandrian. "Me die, man live." And then Oyarsa responds, "Yet you know that these creatures would have to be made quite unlike you before they live on other worlds. Yes, yes, all new, no one know yet, strange, big. Then it is not the shape of the body that you love. No, me no care how they shaped. One would think then that it is for the mind you care, but that cannot be, or you would have loved the hanao wherever you met it. Hanao just means anything that is capable of intelligence and reason. No care for hanao, care for man. But if it is neither man's mind, which is as the mind of all other hanao, is not Melaldo maker of them all, nor his body which will change. If you care for neither of these, what do you mean by man? Me care for man, care for our race, what man begets. Strange, said Oyarsa. You do not love any one of your race. You would have let me kill ransom. You do not love the mind of your race, nor their body. Any kind of creature will please you, if only it is begotten by your kind as they now are. It seems to me, thick one, that what you really love is no completed creature, but the very seed itself, for that is all that is left. Blip, blip, blip. Just quickly review things. Does anybody have any questions or anything, by the way? I know that I'm kind of maybe going through a lot.
I really enjoyed how he made the human, from the reader standpoint, take the vibe of like the tribal savage when you just hear him speaking this broken language. It's really a funny turning of the tables. It's good.
Yeah, it's really funny because when they're first brought, because like Weston, and it's again very similar to H.G. Wells's The First Man in the Moon, right, where the humans are brought forward to the person in charge. And in this case, it's not a big head, but it's more like a spirit, you could say, in some ways that they're talking to. And at first, they never, Weston and Divine are never able to actually see Oyarsa, because Oyarsa partakes in a certain kind of light, which you have to, it's almost like you have to kind of, it's like Dante's paradise, right? You need to get into a higher level of being before you can start to see that light more clearly. Otherwise, it'll either be invisible to you or it will be like a very blurry kind of thing that you can't quite identify. And when they're first brought in front of the Oyarsa, they're hearing a voice speaking to them, Weston and Divine, and they're thinking that it's some kind of witch doctor voodoo trick. And they point out one of the sleeping Harosa, and they're saying like he's the one, he's doing some kind of ventriloquism, and so well, it's just a funny scene of like Weston trying to talk down to them and everything, when in fact they're facing something that is so much more sophisticated and beyond them. Matt, is that you, or someone has to mute themselves?
Yeah, no, I'll fix that somehow.
Yeah, and then like at one point, Weston is also trying to bribe them with Woodsworth jewelry, which is like a thing, right, that the British imperialists did. They would go to, these other places and they would say like, oh, fancy jewelry, you do what I want, kind of thing. But yeah, it's funny because they're the ones that are speaking in the broken, because they're the true savages, right? They always assume that that the one different from them is the savage. So what C.S. Lewis is getting at here is that Weston is different from Divine in the sense that Divine is, or Divine, I wish I knew which way to say it, is only motivated by greed. So it's the lowest form, and that's why. Did we read this yet? No, I don't think we read it. Sorry. Okay. So Weston says, tell him, when he had been made to understand this, that I don't pretend to be a metaphysician. I have not come here to chop logic. If he cannot understand, as apparently you can't either, to ransom, anything so fundamental as a man's loyalty to humanity, I can't make him understand it. Then Oyarsa responds, I see now how the Lord of the silent light, in other words, the Satan, who is the Oyarsa of that silent world, has bent you. There are laws that all Hanau know of pity and straight dealing and shame and the like. And one of these is the love of kindred. He has taught you to break all of them except this one, which is not one of the greatest laws. This one he has bent till it becomes folly and has set it up, thus bent, to be a little blind Oyarsa in your brain. And now you can do nothing but obey it. Though if we ask you why it is a law, you can give no other reason for it than for the other and greater laws which it drives you to disobey. Do you know why he has done this? Weston responds, me think no such person, in other words, God. Me wise, new man as in he's now the man of modern science. No believe all that old talk of the ancients. And then Oyarsa responds, I will tell you, he has left you this one law because a bent Hanau can do more evil than a broken one. He has only bent you, but this thin one, Divine, who sits on the ground, he has broken, for he has left him nothing but greed. He is now only a talking animal, and in my world he could do no more evil than an animal. Tell me, thick one, why do you come here? So he's clearly differentiating it's like a completely different species of, you can say, bad between Divine and Weston, because Weston is willing to sacrifice. He's willing to sacrifice for something larger than himself. He does have a certain principle, but as Oyarsa is pointing out, it really is just this one law that he has kept and thrown out all other laws, which is the love of, what partakes in you, what begets of you and he has interpreted this very narrowly as his biological material. But the thing is that he doesn't understand, Weston, is that so you can partake in evil, and you can be a higher level of evil only by bending pre-existing laws. You can't create your own laws anew, because we live in a world that was created with these laws, and to rebel against it is ultimately insanity and also destructive. It's not going to help you. It's not going to help anybody, because things were made in, as Leibniz would say, it's the perfect of all worlds in the sense of the potential. The direction is the purpose towards always an ever perfecting good, ever perfection, right? So why rebel against this? It's because you don't want to be this regard of, for instance, mortality is one of the things that modern science really wants to rebel against, and there's a lot of upset over the fact that we live mortal lives. And C.S. Lewis makes the point as well that nothing is made in this world to exist forever, including a species. That's what he's putting forward. And is that really the ultimate good, is to just exist for as long as you can, or possibly forever? So again, this whole concept of like, I'm thinking about this more metaphorically. I don't think about it literally, but that Satan, which is the representation of evil within humankind on Earth, is basically defined from this context as anything that wants to oppose the laws of the creator, or you can call them natural law as well, which is what Plato also described, and they're completely in harmony, and C.S. Lewis makes this point as well. So it's to rebel against the laws of creation and to try to create your own. And you can see this right now with where we're headed in modern science in terms of transhumanism and so forth, where you want to actually change the nature of humankind first you want to narrowly define humankind, or like you see the H.G. Wells world, you want to create specializations that are kind of like monstrosities and like without soul, basically. And it's all about utility and function. And then there's this other idea that you could possibly be a big brain that could, you know, live in a jar for like centuries, and this is considered a great thing. I don't know if I'm speaking very clearly here, but basically these things are going to be talked about in much greater detail with Perelandra and that hideous strength. This is really just kind of introducing people to the subject. So it will become more structured as we go further into the series. So what is this? I'll just read it. The weakest of my people does not fear death. It is the bent one. Right, this is, I think, Weston speaking. The weakest of my people does not fear death. It is the bent one, the Lord of your world, who wastes your lives and befouls them with flying from what you know. Okay, no, this is Oyarsa. The weakest of my people do not fear death on Malacandra. It is the bent one, Satan, the Lord of your world, who wastes your lives and befouls them with flying from what you know will overtake you in the end. If you were subjects of Malaldil, you would have peace. So it's a lot, I think, to go through, especially if people are not familiar with Plato, but this whole idea of, you know, Gorgias is a very good introduction for people who want to read Plato, because he goes over these themes, which C.S. Lewis also revisits in numerous works of his, this relationship between pleasure and pain. And is pleasure always the best thing? Is pain always the worst thing? In the ultimate consequence of things, and also how a tyrant is the most disempowered person of all. So this, everybody does something, whether we categorize them as evil or not, because they truly believe that it is the best thing for them to be doing. They might call it a necessary evil, right? But they still believe that it's something that they have to do. And what C.S. Lewis is making the point here is that if you were to follow along the lines of the natural law, you would find peace. You wouldn't have to feel this way. I feel I'm not explaining it the best, but anyway. So Weston responds, trash, defeat is trash. You say you're Malaldil, let all go dead. Other one, bent one, he fight, jump, live, not all talkie. Me no care, Malaldil, like bent one better, me on his side. And Oyarsa says, but do you not see that he never will nor can basically, you know, succeed? Because you're basically rebelling against something that you can't fundamentally change. And that's not a bad thing. So at the end of Out of the Silent Planet, and we're pretty much at the end of this lecture, he's making, he could have ended the story just as that, right? Ransom is able to return back to Earth with Weston and Divine. The Oyarsa of Mars says that it's not within, you know, his power, his jurisdiction, you can say, to deal with Devon and Weston. So they all arrive back at Earth, and the first thing Ransom does is he goes into a pub and orders a pint of bitter. And then you have the last chapter, and the last chapter is C.S. Lewis pretty much saying the reason why he wrote Out of the Silent Planet. He said, I could have left it as a fiction, but the thing is that I don't really think of it fully as fiction, and we'll go into what he means by this. He says, at this point, all right, blah, blah, blah. At this point, if I were guided by purely literary considerations, my story would end, but it is time to remove the mask and to acquaint the reader with the real and practical purpose for which this book has been written. So C.S. Lewis describes, so Ransom is actually, right, in discussion with C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis brings himself up as an actual character in this chapter. In Dr. Ransom, again, it's Tolkien. So C.S. Lewis writes a letter to Ransom before he knew about Ransom's travels, because Ransom didn't want to talk about it with anybody when he arrived to Earth, because he obviously thought people would think him crazy. And C.S. Lewis writes, I am now working at the Platonists on the Platonists of the 12th century, and incidentally discovering that they wrote damnably difficult Latin. In one of them, Bernardus Silvestris, there is a word I should particularly like your views on, the word oyarses. It occurs in the description of a voyage through the heavens, and an oyarses seems to be the intelligence or tutelary spirit of a heavenly sphere. In other words, in our language, of a planet. So he's basically saying that Bernardus Silvestris is a real person. Actually, we'll talk about that in the next slide, what he's talking about here. A good many facts, which I have no intention of publishing at present, have fallen into our hands. Facts about planets in general, about Mars in particular, facts about medieval Platonists, and not the least in importance, facts about the professor to whom I am giving the fictitious name of Weston. So we find out that Weston is actually modeled on a real person that Tolkien and Lewis knows, probably at Cambridge, but they're not going to tell you who his actual name is. A systematic report of these facts might, of course, be given to the civilized world, but that would almost certainly result in universal incredulity and in libel action from Weston. At the same time, we both feel that we cannot be silent. We are being daily confirmed in our belief that the Oyarses of Mars was right when it said that the present celestial year was to be a revolutionary one, that the long isolation of our own planets is nearing its end, and that great doings are on foot. We have found reason to believe that the medieval Platonists were living in the same celestial year as ourselves. In fact, that it began in the 12th century of our era, and that the occurrence of the name Oyarsa, Latinized as Oyarses or Oraces, in Bernardus Silvestris is not an accident. So it's C.S. Lewis, for those who are not aware, he was a professor at Cambridge who specialized in English literature of the 12th century, but also he viewed the medieval period as, and rightfully so, as not how they did not think at all in the same way that we have been trained to think since the Enlightenment and with the advent of modern science, which again, we'll go into in part 2 because it's a lot to unpack at this point in this lecture. But the point being is that these historical works of fiction are also have relevance in commentary of how the universe functions, but also, you know, historical veins as well. And so C.S. Lewis comes across Bernardus Silvestris. What did I say? Right. So yeah, this ending is a clear indication of how Lewis ultimately wanted his readers to read his sci-fi series as not only metaphorical or allegorical, but also reawakening what had budded during the 12th century medieval period in the understanding of the universe that we live in, that such a world of mysticism regarded as a dark age from the viewpoint of modern science was more real than we might have previously imagined, that truth is stranger than fiction. And Bernardus Silvestris, just it's his Cosmographia that C.S. Lewis is referencing, which I didn't have enough time to look into it, but it's basically a kind of mythological account of how the universe is structured, using, it seems, concepts of physics as well. Like, it's not just mythology, but he's also bringing in what we would call under the domain of science. And he was a Platonist philosopher and a poet of the 12th century. What's interesting about the Cosmographia is that it heavily influenced, there's evidence to support, Chaucer, as well as Dante. I don't have it here, but Dante and Boccaccio and Nicholas of Cusa as well. So definitely so there must be something to that. And interestingly, Bernardus also did there's some controversy over whether he did write it or not, but that he wrote a commentary on Virgil's Aeneid, and that this is the largest commentary that I think exists to this day on the story, which is basically Virgil's Aeneid is based off of Homer's Odyssey, as Jerry has talked about in detail. So maybe he also didn't have access to Homer, because in those times you didn't have access to all of the works always. So interesting that C.S. Lewis is bringing this all together. And he ends with, we have also evidence increasing almost daily that Weston, or the force or forces behind Weston, because you have like the satanic forces basically who are now kind of supporting Weston, will play a very important part in the events of the next few centuries. So it's also the Western archetype, right, of modern science, that this kind of character will play a very important role in the next few centuries. And unless we prevent them, a very disastrous one. We do not mean that they are likely to invade Mars. Our cry is not merely hands off Malacandra. The dangers to be feared are not planetary, but cosmic, or at least solar, and they are not temporal, but eternal. More on this would be unwise to say. It was Dr. Ransom who first saw that our only chance was to publish in the form of fiction what would certainly not be listened to as a fact. He even thought, greatly overrating my literary powers, that this might have the incidental advantage of reaching a wider public, and that certainly it would reach a great many people sooner than Weston. To my objection that if accepted as fiction, it would for that very reason be regarded as false, he replied that there would be indications enough in the narrative for the few readers, the very few, who at present were prepared to go farther into the matter. And they, said Dr. Ransom, will easily find out you or me and will easily identify Weston. Anyways, what we need for the moment is not so much a body of belief as a body of people familiarized with certain ideas. If we could even effect in 1% of our readers a change over from the conception of space to the conception of heaven, we should have made a beginning. And I will leave it at that. I don't know if it was a bit of a jumbled mess with my presentation, but it's hard because I want to give people an idea of what these stories are in more detail, and so I like to always share dialogue, but I'm also open to feedback if this isn't maybe the best format for part 2. I'll definitely have to do a little bit of it for Perelandra, but that hideous strength, I might not use that format. So part 2 will be Perelandra and that hideous strength, which is the one that I think most people get excited over, that has a lot of relevance to the kind of transhumanist veins that we're seeing occurring now.